Hello and welcome to another League of Legends commentary. So for today's video I'm going to be discussing an in-depth view of what junglers are, what they do, some tips and tricks for general jungling, and some item choices for junglers. Now there are a lot of possible junglers. One of the most important things about a jungler is that they can clear the new upgraded camps much more quickly. So champions that can do that are really good at jungling, obviously. So there's several categories of junglers. There's a bunch of like AD bruiser type junglers. So those are junglers like Xin Zhao that they can get up in the middle of a team fight. They do some pretty good damage, DPS, and that's their role. They can clear the jungles pretty quickly. They're probably the fastest clearers usually because they do the most damage, sustained damage to creeps. There are tanky junglers like Amumu. They are tanky, so like Malphite, Amumu, things like that. Those are all people that can clear the jungle, but it takes them a little longer because they don't, do as much sustained damage to the creeps, so they're a little bit slower. But they provide a different role in team fights. They're the tank, obviously. So if your team doesn't have a tank and you need one, then you can certainly choose one of those. There's some supporty junglers, so like Nunu is a great example of a person that can jungle with Consume, so he does a lot of damage with that. And late game, he acts as a support. Like he is like a bit more tanky than a straight up support Nunu, but his main role is really just to be a supportive tank. So these are just different roles. They're all a little different, little bits of variation, and you can choose like the person that best fits your play style. As far as masteries, for the most part, the most crucial masteries for jungling is bladed armor and the -2 to monster damage. So make sure you get those on most of your junglers. There are some exceptions. For instance, Fiddlesticks, he doesn't really need to get monster damage reduction because he doesn't really take any damage in the jungler by using his drain, which is his W. But generally speaking, you definitely want bladed armor, and Butcher is very good on the AD bruisers. So if you're doing 80 damage, you definitely want Butcher. So that's for masteries. For runes, attack speed runes are very good. I was calculating DPS for them, and the attack speed are actually better for DPS than any of the other runes. So that's just something to consider. As far as jungling routes, the most common is to start at wolves, then do blue here, and then go to wraiths, red, and golems. Now this can take a fair amount of time, and it can also do you a fair amount of damage, so you can always change that up depending on what the individual match situation is. So for instance, you might want to do an early level 2 gank, and you can get that right after you finish your blue, so you can either gank top or mid. So those are the basic, straightforward jungling routes. As far as the best lanes to gank, I think right now ganking bot is very difficult, because bots get lots of ward now. Lots of wards. So like they'll cover everything, and they'll have like a side stone, so it's very difficult to gank. Sometimes you can get a lane gank in, but for the most part it's quite challenging. Now mid is much more reasonable to gank, and there are 4 different routes that you can come through to gank mid. So if I'm on the blue side, I can come up through this river here, so coming around and then ganking up here. On the same side, I can come around this brush and then come behind, so I'm like closer to their tower. This is going to give them less time to react and to escape, and a lot of times they'll flash when you see them, so you can burn a flash. And it's parallel to the other side, so like this for the left side. So that's just how you gank mid, and mid is a great lane to gank. You can really snowball your mid, so he becomes a very strong force. Like he gets free farm, he gets gold from kills or assists, and it makes it very easy. Now, mid is a little bit more challenging to gank than top, because top has to run so much further. So like if they push up this lane, they have to run all the way back here, whereas mid just has to run from here to get back to their tower, where you can see the distance is much longer if you gank top. And so a lot of tops have started wards now, and so that just makes it more difficult to gank. Again, there are several routes that you can go to gank top. You can come up to the lane here, and it can be just a straightforward gank where you just try to jump on him as soon as you see him. That's going to have a low percentage of chance of being successful, although some people can make it work. You can also get your top lane to push out the lane, and then you just come up, sneak through this bush, and make sure that enemy minions don't see you, and then just camp up here, and when they push back out, you just jump on them. So that's how you can gank top. And there are two other routes. You can come through here, this route here, or you can come behind here. So this is obviously the best route if it's not warded. It gives them the least amount of reaction time and you can sneak up on them. And this is not bad either, especially if they're pushed up. So either these two are really good if they're pushed up. This one is obviously closer, so you can do it more quickly. But if they're sort of in the middle lane, you definitely want to gank through this direction. So that's how you gank the two best lanes to gank, mid and top. Now if you're ganking bot, again, there's a couple of different ways. You can come up through the lane and do that brush gank that I was talking before, and when they push out, you kill them. That's probably going to have the highest chance of success if they're warding, and probably what you're going to be doing. If it's warded, then you really can't gank from these directions unless they're not paying attention. And so, but you can come through here to try to gank them if they're pushed up the tower. If they're about here, you can try to come through here. But again, this is going to have a low chance of success. And the third type of ganking is counter ganking. So you need wards on the map to do this. And what happens is when you see the enemy jungler going towards lane, so let's say I saw him at blue, there's a ward here, and I see him coming down going this direction, and I can have a pretty good guess that he's trying to gank bot lane. Then I can just come up to this lane as soon as I can and wait for them to jump on my team, and then I just respond, and they get surprised and don't react properly, and you can just get a kill. Okay, so this is, I hope I provided you guys with a basic idea of what junglers do and routes to gank. Now the second thing that I'm going to discuss is first item choices. As far as first item choices, Hunter's Machete and 5 pots is standard on most junglers. You can start boots 3 health pots. That's an all-in strategy. You're trying for an early level 2, level 3 gank. And the reason you start boots is so you can chase them down. If they have flash, they can just flash away, and there's a high chance of failure for that too if you're ganking a lane with flash, especially if it's like mid or something like that where they just flash back to their turret. So again, boots is certainly a starting choice, and the most common starting choice I'd say is probably Hunter's Machete's 5 pots. You could also start cloth armor 5 pots as well if you don't really think you're going to turn the machete into anything useful. And people that wouldn't are like very tanky people, like they might not want to they might just want to skip Spirit of the Ancient Golem, which is something that you would consider if you're building tanky. So yeah, you can start boots, cloth armor, or Hunter's Machete depending on your playstyle and what champion you're playing. Obviously, AD Bruiser, you definitely want to start Hunter's Machete. An obvious exception starting Hunter's Machetes is Fiddlesticks. He just gets you just want AP to make his jungle faster. You're never really auto attacking creep, so it's not going to do anything. Although it will make it quicker to clear camps with its unique passive. And the Hunter's Machete can be turned into 2 things: the Madred's Razor and the Spirit Stone. So I like the Spirit Stone a lot more than the Madred's. The Madred's, obviously, you need to have some sort of attack speed bonus to make this more useful. So again, it's doing 300 damage every 4 shots basically. So that's just what it does. And 300 divided by 4, it's going to do a bit more damage, 75 damage per shot. And basically that's what it does. And it can be turned into a Wriggle's Lantern, so it can give you some sustain. And I like the Spirit Stone because it has a lot more flexibility. It can be turned into any of these items. If you're an AP champion, you could potentially get this item. It's pretty good, I think, for AP champions, although it is very expensive. Also, you could get Spirit of the Ancient Golem for tanky champions, or you could get this damage item. Again, these are very expensive items, and I don't really like getting them that much. But I do like the Spirit Stone to rush that first because it gives you a very nice chunk of increased damage to help you clear out dragons, your camps, so you can get all those things more quickly. And it gives you regen in both health and mana, so I think it's a great item. Okay, so I've discussed the first early item choices, what runes and masteries you can get, jungling routes, best lengths to get to gank, and what junglers do. As far as early fights, there's a couple things that you should understand. So this is like levels 1 through 6. So basically, you're gonna, if it's pre-6 probably, you're not gonna have wards. The enemy champions are not gonna have wards in their junglers. In the jungler routes. So it's going to be easy to gank them. So that's just one thing to consider, and they're probably going to flash away. So one thing that you can do is you can run up to them and wait for them to flash and then use your gap closer to catch up. So if you use the gap closer at the start of the fight, they can just flash away and then they get away basically. But if you wait till they flash, then use your gap closer, for instance Zin's E, or if you have a slow or something like that, or fear, then it's a lot easier to gank them. So that's just one thing that you should be doing in earlier fights, not necessarily blowing your flash and your gap closures until they've used theirs. Now they're going to have to flash, and the reason is that if they're pushed up to the tower, they can't just walk away because you're cutting them off and preventing them from retreating. So again, they're going to have to flash, basically. Another thing that's important is not being low when you do an early fight. And this is just having the right masteries and ruins in the jungle, and also chugging your health pots as often as you can to stay at high health. So if you're very low, what's going to happen is potentially you're going to die and you're going to lose your double buffs, and you're going to give them to the enemy champion. So that's the worst case scenario. Or you're just going to lose your double buffs and be set very far behind. If they're smart, they're just going to focus you if you're low. So you really need to make sure you're high health when you're trying to gank a lane that could potentially turn around and kill you. So that's what you're basically trying to do levels 1 through 6. Now after 6 through 11, these levels you're still out in the laning phase. Bot still has 2 people down here, they're still warding and stuff, mid is still here, top is still here. For the most part, this is what's going to be happening. And when you gank, you should try to turn that gank into some sort of advantage. So if you can gank top, and this is great with 80 bruisers because they do lots of damage, you can take a tower off of that. And this gives your team global gold. It sets your team further ahead so you can snowball lanes. And then top can come mid and put pressure on mid, and you can get more and more towers and more objectives and keep snowballing your team further and further ahead. So this is something that you can do. If you have a successful gank, your team is pretty healthy after the gank, so you had a really good gank, you can secure an objective off of that. So that's something that you need to do after you get a gank, a successful gank, to really snowball your team. Now, the other thing that's nice about having a good jungler is they make the enemy lanes scared, so they're less willing to be aggressive if they get punished for being aggressive. So for instance, if they push up to the tower, start harassing people, and you just keep diving on them whenever they do that, then they're going to stop doing that, and the lanes become much easier for the rest of your allied champions. So this is what the power of the jungler really brings. Securing objectives after a gank and making it really difficult for enemies to be very aggressive on your allies. Now the fourth possible mid to early game objective that you can secure, potentially as early as level 6, is the dragon. So if you have a successful gank, bot, or potentially mid, you know that you have more team members than the enemy does, and if they're all pretty healthy, you can attempt to do dragon, and it becomes very difficult for them to stop you if you have more team members. They just can't fight that. Even with dragon smacking on you, you can just turn and kill them, or you can potentially just finish off the dragon too quickly for them to deal with. So if you have a successful gank bottom again or mid, you can turn that into an early dragon kill or a tower. So these are the things that you want to do after getting the objective, or after securing a kill in a lane. And this is really important. A lot of times people will just not do this, and it makes it much more difficult for your team to snowball, and it doesn't really reward your team for all these great plays that you're making. Now for mid game, jungler is still relatively strong, and his roles change somewhat. So he's less of a ganker. Usually some of these towers have calmed down, so there's less of a laning phase going on anymore. And his role changes less from ganking to more of a team fighter. And so you just need to make sure you're sticking with your team. It's okay to still be farming your jungle somewhat, but you need to make sure you're showing up at team fights and making your presence felt. So it's changed less to straight farming your jungle plus ganking to more farming your jungle and team fighting, because you're not really going to get as many ganks off now. The second thing that you need to be doing is buying wards, and that lets you make plays. So if you have wards in their jungle and you catch their jungler trying to go through their jungle and get a kill off them, then it makes it possible to secure these second tier towers. Now, just trying to push these second tier towers is very difficult because they do more damage than the first tier towers. So it's a lot easier for enemy teams to defend them. So getting a pick off of someone is a great way to be able to push down a tower. So that's just something you should consider doing. Buying these wards so that you can get a pick so you can get a second tier tower down. Now some teams are able to push down second tier towers, but without really any assistance, but that's not always the case. So it's very important to do this. Secondly, you need to understand your role in team fights. Like I said before, you're going to be doing a lot more team fights. 6 to 11, those are lots and lots of mid-game team fights. And you need to understand what your role is. So you have to consider, am I trying to burst down a squishy champion? So that's like an assassin, something like Nocturne. So you need to wait till like the enemy team engages, and then you jump on the enemy team's squishy and take them out of the fight, preventing them from having any DPS in that fight. So you need a gap closer to be an assassin, and you need to do a fair amount of damage, and you need damage items. So if this is your role, you need to be building damage items. And a great example of this is the Black Cleaver. It gives you all the stealth that you want. It's going to be nerfed next patch, so it's going to change, but it's a great item to give you all the stats that you need for an assassin. However, if your role is to be tanky, and a tank role is to initiate fights usually, and also to soak up CC and take damage for the rest of your team, then you need to buy tanky items. So if you're someone like Amumu, you might want to consider getting a Sunfire Cape, brushing that as your first item. Your Sunfire Cape gives you lots and lots of effective health. It gives you a huge increase in base effective health, 450, and 45 armor. So that's basically a 45% increase in effective health. So that's a great item to rush early. There are some other items that you can rush early that are also pretty good. So Warmogs is pretty good. Obviously, it's pretty close in comparison to the Sunfire. So you can just see that it has twice the amount of health and a passive health regen, but it doesn't give you as much armor. So if you think that the enemy team is heavily armor focused, as in they're doing 80 damage, then Sunfire is going to be a great first item to rush. If they do true damage, so for instance if they have a Cho'Gath or a Darius, then you definitely want to consider rushing a Warmogs, and if they do mixed damage, Warmogs is a great first item to rush for a tanky jungler. However, do you want to do sustained damage and be tanky? Now this becomes much more difficult because you start having to cut corners. So you can't just get your straight up Warmogs because that's too much gold to invest right away into that item to be both tanky and do damage. So you have to consider alternatives. The Black Cleaver is great because it basically does both of that, but sometimes you can't get that. So for instance, Phage is a good choice to consider for tanky items that also give you defense. Here's some other great items. So attack speed, Wit's End is a great item to consider. So that's this item. Where is it? Here. It's 2,200 gold, so it's pretty expensive, but it gives you both stats. It gives you both basically effective health by giving you MR, and it gives you a bunch of damage. So that's an early item to consider. Obviously, Sword of the Divine, it doesn't give you defensive stats, so that's something that's a strike against it. Another great item to consider to be both tanky and damage dealing is Hexdrinker. So all these items I pointed out are obviously magic resist items, and there aren't too many great items that both give you basically effective health and do damage. So your options are pretty limited basically on what's going on here. So yeah, Phage is a great example of something that gives you both damage and also gives you defensive stats. So these are some of the things that you consider. I've discussed early game, mid game, and then late game. It's too difficult to really give you general guidelines on what to do late game. Obviously, you want to get Barons, take inhibs, take the third tier towers, and win the game. But how that comes about, it can be very variable, and it's very difficult for me to just say do this, do that, because it's going to change from game to game. So I hope I provided you with a general idea of what you want to be doing as a jungler and what your role is in team games. So again, I've discussed junglers and what they do, specific mastery, so bladed armor is great for junglers because it gives a great increase in effective DPS. For 80 junglers, Butcher, that's in the offensive tree, that's also a great choice. For runes, attack speed runes are a great choice on attack damage junglers, so make sure you choose that. I've discussed what are the best lanes to gank. That was top and mid. If bot isn't warding, then that's a great choice too. And there's some ways that you can get around the bot warding. I've discussed first item choices, so that's whether you should get Madrids, whether you should get Spirit Stone. And again, I think Spirit Stone is usually a good choice. And I've discussed some exceptions, so that's like Fiddlesticks, doesn't need any of those. I've discussed early fights, so you want to chug your health pots and stay high so you don't get killed when you gank and give up your double buffs. And I've also discussed how you need to secure objectives. So turn that gank into a tower. That's a lot of extra gold. Or turn it into a dragon. So those are some things that you need to consider after ganking. And then I've discussed what you should be considering in mid game. So I hope you found this video informative. Let me know if you have any feedback or suggestions on what I should do next. And please remember to rate, subscribe, and comment.